will join, but of course it is we are meeting within a course, so of course the first are students. It was more let's say more active rather than the one way and one monologue that they used to with my lectures, to do a sort of interview, let's say a discussion where actually I will give input to Professor Achcar related to the wide topic of the uprising. Springs will talk about that in the first question 10 years later, and of course that will take roughly half of the time that we have, the 2 hours, and then we will have hopefully enough time for more inputs coming from students and from non-students. By the way, of course, I have already highlighted that this is within a course, and so students have to be here, but also friends and also people that I don't know that might have seen my posts or that departments and others have made are also welcome, of course, within in a polite way, to ask questions or to give a few comments. I would start, of course, after thanking Gilbert again for agreeing in being with us here virtually, unlikely enough, but hopefully soon also live in Rome or wherever, or maybe in Sardinia like last time we met, which was quite brilliant. I would start for the question of definition, because, you know, in a way there has been a debate whether there was like the Arab revolutions, revolts, uprisings in the plural. And I've noticed that Professor Achcar uses uprising, not only the first book, The People Want, it's a radical exploration of the Arab uprising, but even in the last one, the latest one, not the last one, it's Morbid Symptoms, Relapse in the Arab Uprising. And in his writings in Arabic, in fact, it's almost often translated as Al-Intifada al-Arabiya. So this is, let's start with the question of definition. Why Arab uprising in a singular? What do you mean by that? And how do you see the other interpretation, starting from the definition? Because definition, yes, might seem an academic question, but in fact, they also say quite a lot, in my opinion. So please, Gilbert, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Grazie mille, Gennaro. Thank you very much for this introduction, for this opportunity to meet your students. And I mean, I usually say that since we started this lockdown, but rarely with so much sincerity that I would so much have preferred to be with you in Rome. That is very, very strong feeling. Anyway, yes, about the why did I use uprising in the subtitles of the 2 books? For the simple reason that this is the least disputable term to be used about it, about what was going on, what started in 2011, actually in December 2010 from Tunisia, but the real events were in 2011. I wouldn't use Arab Spring because that's a formula with a lot of problems. It was based on a lot of illusions, at least in the year 2011. Today, it has become a kind of historical designation of the year 2011, so it's no problem. I have less problem using Arab Spring today about what happened than at the time, because at the time that was linked to the idea that would be brief, smooth, just democratic transition, you know, what usually people call springs in history or politics. And then you have the term revolution, which of course is a concept that requires discussion, and I discuss it in the introduction to The People Want. But I wouldn't just call what happened a revolution in scientific terms, in the sense that it was the beginning of a process. That's why I preferred the formula, which I find much more accurate, of a long-term revolutionary process. That is, for me, a much better and clearer designation of what was happening. So the least, as I said, disputable is that these were uprisings. That you had 6 major uprisings. You had, starting from the Tunisian uprising, then you had the Egyptian one, and then you had you were in Cairo at that time, weren't you? Yeah. So you had the privilege of witnessing that firsthand. That was great. Then you had Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. 6 countries had major uprisings in the year 2011. Now, I have seen and I have analyzed those 6 uprisings, along with the very sharp rise in social and political protest in all other countries, with the exception of the very artificial Qatar and United Arab Emirates, where only 10% of the population have citizenship. All the rest are migrants. So if you put aside these 2 exceptions, where people don't dare raise their voice because they are just expelled from the country and lose their jobs, other than that, all other countries, including countries of the Gulf monarchies like Oman, of course, Bahrain we mentioned. So all other countries have seen some important rise or form of important rise in social protest and political protest. And so we were facing a phenomenon which was not restricted to one country, but a whole region, a whole geopolitical and cultural ensemble, having in common a language, of course, but a language is not enough to explain why something spreads like this and shakes a whole region. So there was obviously something much deeper, and that is what I devoted the first book to analyzing, which are the deep roots of this big, what I called long-term revolutionary process. So that's the point. Now, about the term revolution, I don't have any problem with people like, for instance, in Egypt, they call what happened ثورة 25 يناير. So the term thawra is used in all the countries. The Syrians say thawra, the Libyans, the Yemeni, everybody says thawra. Now, the term thawra in Arabic, anyhow, and that is what many scholars who should know better completely overlook when they know Arabic, is that the term thawra in Arabic doesn't mean necessarily revolution. It can mean revolt. It's a much more polysemic term, if you want, from that angle, because the root is to revolt, to rise up, if you want. So thawra is absolutely no problem. Secondly, the idea that for an event to be called a revolution, you need to have a radical social and economic change is not something that is, again, part of the necessary definition of a revolution, because you can speak of political revolutions. That is changing the political regime radically. You can call that political revolution, especially if it comes from below, from a mass movement. And in that sense, for instance, Tunisia had a political revolution. Egypt had a political revolution, albeit short-lived. Okay, then you had a restoration. And again, the idea that if it failed, it can't be a revolution, again, is not sustained by history. We speak of the Russian Revolution of 1905, which failed. So again, you know, so the term revolution is a term itself, also a term that may have different meanings. The key point is that it usually refers to a big mass uprising against a regime, a government. You know, the minimal is the fact that the people wants to change the regime, and that is exactly, as you know well, Gennaro, the key slogan of the whole thing, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, which means the people wants to overthrow the regime or the system or whatever the term.
Well, I think that was enough as an introduction, and I think that you know, looking at your writings, there are, of course, and that will be the thing that we are very interested in, looking at the different trajectories. But before that, because there is the question of using again Intifada Arabia in terms of communalities. I know that I'm not offering the service to the students so that the authors sum up the book so they don't have to read it. Not quite the opposite. But when you say, you know, in terms of deep roots of the uprising, that where there is sheer communality, I mean, I have devoted actually yesterday lecture to that. But I would like also to hear from you to what extent, even if of course there are different trajectories of different countries, along where we can actually try to isolate also in a hindsight, so 10 years later, and looking at the 2000, some commonalities in the roots of the uprising, which took, of course, different shapes.
Yeah, well, that's precisely the point. The overwhelming perception of what happened in 2011, especially in the media, was that this was a democratic uprising, that people were rising up because they wanted democracy and freedom, right? Okay, I mean, that is indisputable that people wanted democracy and freedom. But that was a very short explanation for what was happening, because why would people now demand democracy and freedom, whereas they have had decades of despotism, right? And secondly, the regimes that where it started, especially the Egypt, was far from being the most repressive state in the region. You know, it was actually one of the most liberals, in the sense that the opposition could, could even open headquarters and all that, could be active, could hold meetings, left to right. The Muslim Brotherhood were tolerated and had a huge organization. The far left was tolerated. So everybody was there. So this idea that that was just a matter of democracy, or a democratic transition, as they call it in political science, was, let's say, if not a misperception, at least a shallow one, a superficial understanding of what was going. Because, in fact, when you have even democratic transitions, there may be provoked by two very different and contradictory conditions. One condition is states that have been through a long process of development and modernization and industrialization under dictatorships, and they reach a stage where you have the formation of a large working class, a middle class, and all that. So you have the social constituents of democratic change. And then you have this democratic change. Maybe to take two very clear big examples, Brazil, South Korea, right? That's exactly what happens. And in both countries, which also the mainstream democratic transition theory overlooks, the role of the working class, the labor movement, was crucial, right? So that's one kind of condition. Now, on the other hand, you may have a democratic transition because a system has been blocked and stagnating and no more development. You had a blockage of development. That is, for instance, what happened in Eastern Europe, you know, after years of stagnation, economic stagnation in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and that's when those regimes collapsed. So the point is that for the Arab countries, it's not the Brazil or South Korean case. It is closer to the Eastern European case, in the sense that the kind of social political system that prevailed in the region had caused a blockage of development. The whole region has had the lowest rates of economic growth for a few decades before the explosion. And this had translated in various ways, but the most relevant for the understanding of the events was that this part of the world, the Arabic-speaking world, the Middle East and North Africa, has held the highest rates of youth unemployment in the world for several decades, actually, before the uprisings. So that's where you understand that the roots, the deep roots of the explosion really lie. That is, you've had an accumulation of economic, social problems. You have a rising rate of unemployment and a rise in all sorts of such problems, which created a very powerful discontent all over the region. And it took one successful example, the Tunisian one, to bring everybody else into motion, right? And that's what happened. And so now, at the same time, when you understand this, you get to, of course, I mean, this is, you know, the general reason, but then what is the reason for the reason? That is, why did you have such slow economic growth and the rest? And here, the analysis I offered is that the social political system of states that exist is one in which private capitalism is not willing to invest in the kind of investment that produce development. And therefore, the neoliberal transformation that led to reducing the role of the state, the investment of the state, and all that, this whole thing of the Washington Consensus since the 80s and in the region that accelerated in the 90s and the 2000s. This was based on the idea that the state would, take the back seat economically, and the private sector will produce miracles. This didn't happen. And so the result was that you had a decline in investment over the decades. And this decline of investment produced very low economic, rates of economic growth, hardly keeping up with the demography, right? And that produced in turn this massive youth unemployment, very big youth unemployment, including, by the way, a very high, a disproportionate graduate unemployment. And that's also an important feature because that also shows you, explains also why you have so many of those young tech savvy, as they say, young people, knowing to use those new technologies and the Facebook and the Twitter and whatever it is that played a key role in the organization of all this. So that's the key analysis. So when you get to all this understanding, then the conclusion becomes there won't be a solution to the crisis without a radical change in the social political nature of the states, right? And so short of that, the region, and I said that from the beginning, entered into a long-term destabilization, a long-term period of upheaval, revolution, counter-revolution, upsurge, backlash, reaction, restoration, as usual, as in the long historical processes in history. That's how they go through phases and contradictory phases. And that's what we got in. And indeed, my second book, Morbid Symptoms, was about the shift, the turn from the revolutionary phase to the counter-revolutionary phase, with the counter-offensive, with Iran's intervention to rescue the Syrian regime, with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's coup in Egypt, and then the year after, civil wars in Libya, civil war in Yemen. So you had, this a turn, counter-revolutionary turn, and many people at that point hurried to bury the whole thing. That it failed, it's finished. Well, I kept saying, no, not at all. This is a long-term revolutionary process. This is normal that you have a backlash phase, if you want, especially in the absence of leaderships able to lead the process of change. But there will be other upsurges, other springs. And there you had it, 8 years after the first one, in December 2018, after December 2010 Tunisia, you had Sudan starting a new wave. You could even point to Jordan, because Jordan, the summer of 2018, also had that very big mass movement that overthrew a government, not the regime, but a government at least. Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, and even the media called it the second Arab Spring. So you had a second wave as expected. This has been suspended because of COVID. COVID played a counter-revolutionary role in that regard, in stopping those mass movements. Very clearly in Algeria, for instance, where the military seized the opportunity of COVID to ban demonstrations. Now they are resuming. But the key point is that COVID at the same time is digging the hole, in the sense that COVID is amplifying and aggravating the economic crisis. The economic crisis is becoming massive. It's becoming very massive, and therefore this will only, once this COVID phase start to fade away, we will see, I'm sure of that, new upsurges and even more powerful upsurges, given the severity of the crisis.
Thanks. We have already touched on a few more points that I think it's quite useful also to sum up. There is the point of course of those that even like in the eve of so before the first couple of two uprisings started, were so adamant that economic grievances are not political per se, and actually that's something that you I think quite successfully debate in the book. So it's something that again should be highlighted. And the second motive, you already have touched on, the so-called one second, please, whoever is not talking, please switch your video and audio off. Thanks. The second point is that, especially in the introduction, the first pages of morbid symptoms, you try to distinguish, looking at the reaction, then we'll talk about the peoples, distinguishing the reaction of those in power, looking at the degree of patrimonialism of the state, in a way, in order to try to make sense of the different trajectory in the full, like between Tunisia, something that seems to be quite unique right now, what happened in Egypt, and then Libya, Syria. And so I would like to ask you whether, if you can also give, especially the students, a sort of deeper idea about this, and if this sort of differentiation that we introduces in your latest book also holds with the so-called second wave that you are talking about, especially when you have cases of very fragmented states and political communities, such as Iraq and Lebanon, whose uprising per se, to me, contradict a lot of all the neo-Orientalists and very, let's say, very shallow explanations. Let's put it this way. It's a lot, I know, so you have all the time.
Yeah, but just remind me of the first question that you raised.
Economic grievances, when and how they become political, they become fuel for political organization.
Yes. Well, about the first one, I think it's, the matter is the accumulation of discontent is a process that goes, gradually, and then it takes always some political spark to ignite it into an explosion. So we had seen this buildup of economic, social and political. No one is denying the political anger, this grievances. However, we can look at how this proceeds. Take, for instance, the country where it first started. Take Tunisia. We see that in the years preceding the uprising, you had a number of local uprisings, local revolts, local protests. Most importantly, in the year 2008, so 2 years before, 2 years and a few months before it started again in December 2010, you had a very important explosion in the south, in the impoverished south of the country, the local Mezzogiorno. You had an explosion, and it was about jobs. It was precisely about this issue that we mentioned, unemployment and all that. Very big explosion about jobs and anger against the system, against the nepotism of the system at all levels, from the top to the bottom. You have nepotism, you have corruption, you have all that. So you had big anger against that, and you had other regional explosions prior to December 2010. And so in December 2010, it was one more of those. And this young man who set himself on fire in Sidi Bouzid, another impoverished region in the center, not the south, it's the center, but it's also, I mean, the coastal north of Tunisia is relatively well off. The center and the south are impoverished parts of the country. Yeah. So this young man who set himself on fire was not the first one to commit suicide as an act of despair because of the social condition and the political issue. But this time, this led, that was the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say in English, to use something related to Orientalism. No, it's not actually Orientalism. It's the translation of an Arabic proverb. So you had a massive protest in the city where he did that, because of what happened, and then it spread like fire to the whole province and then to the whole country. But in order to spread to the whole country, it had to be organized, relayed, and there you had two factors. One are the use of the internet and all that by the youth, but also more importantly, the reason why Tunisia was the first country to manage to overthrow its ruler was because it was the only country actually with a powerful and autonomous labor movement. And this labor movement played an instrumental role in organizing the uprising after the initial explosion, spreading it to the whole country, organizing a general strike. And it is on the day of the general strike in the capital, 14th of January 2011, that the dictator, the despot Ben Ali, fled the country. So we see very clearly here how an accumulation of discontent is sparked at some moment by a political event or a significant event that condensates the anger that has been accumulating and that had already produced explosions of angers. Then it becomes, you have a scale shift, as they call it in contentious politics theory, and then it shifted into this nationwide movement. Now, if you take the second country where it happened, it started differently. In Egypt, 17 parties called for a rally in Tahrir Square on the police day, 25th January, right? Now, that's different. That's organization calling for a rally. However, we see the same accumulation of anger in Egypt over the years preceding the uprising, with especially working class militancy, a lot of industrial action, a peak in industrial action, the largest wave of so-called industrial action, that is worker strikes, sit-ins, etc., in the history of the country, with a peak in 2007, and then it continued at a high rate, much higher rate of workers' struggles than in the years before, until you had this rally and all that, and this big explosion. So you see the same accumulation of social economic discontent, which at some point will shift into a big political movement on the occasion. And here the Tunisian example was very crucial. And so you had what in sociology they call snowballing, or here we could actually, the metaphor of fire, the spread of fire may be more relevant because it spread like wildfire. And the same goes for the other countries. Now, after that, you have different conditions. For instance, you have countries with relatively homogeneous populations ethnically and religiously. And you have countries where you have big sectarian divides. And that's the case of a country like Lebanon or a country like Iraq, which were countries where the sectarian divide blocked there were attempts at joining the Arab Spring, as it was called, in 2011. But for instance, if you take Lebanon, they managed to have 10,000 people in demonstrations, but nothing more. So it couldn't take off. Why? Because it was still blocked by the sectarian system, and each sectarian force controlling or exerting its influence on the members of its community, sectarian community. Now, what changed years later is that the economic anger reached a level that is unbearable. In 2019, you had a huge economic crisis, and the currency, the Lebanese currency, started falling and all that. So there, the economic conditions, the economic grievance, if you want, reached the point of non-tolerance. And so people went in the street and they bypassed the sectarian cleavage. And you had, for the first time in very long history, a mass movement, a popular uprising in October 2019 that covered all parts of the country and all religious communities. And the slogan of that, because in order to do that would make sense, was all of them means all of them. Kullun yani kullun. And they mean by that it was against all the members of the ruling class, of all sects, of all religious communities. So just to say that we, the people, are united against them, the rulers, all of them. And so we won't be fooled this time by the sectarian issues. Well, that was a very good starting point, although then later on you had the same problem, the COVID blockage, and also the fact that one of the key component of power in Lebanon has also an important mass base that it could mobilize against the movement, and I'm here referring to Hezbollah. So that's a very specific issue, but just to say that this is the dynamics that we had.
In terms of what I was asking about, the degree of patrimonialism of the state to this, yeah.
That's a different story. Yes, in the analysis I put forward, I stressed the fact that, unlike what you find in mainstream literature, where they call everything neo-patrimonial, what is missed completely in this picture, because neo-patrimonial, you can say, of most of the global South countries and even some global North countries, that is states where you have some degree of institutional autonomy of the state towards the ruling personnel, right? But nepotism, corruption, and the rest. Italy was not immune, as you know, is not immune to that. So neo-patrimonialism is a very broad category. However, what is important and specific to the Arab region is the existence of a key nucleus of fully patrimonial states. And what is the difference? Patrimonial states are states where there is no real autonomy for the institutions of the state. They are regarded as private property of the ruling family. And therefore, power is transmitted hereditary, of course, because when you say private property, you speak of also hereditary transmission. And that is the case of 8 monarchies. You have 8 monarchies in the region, including the 6 richest, the 6 Gulf Cooperation Council members, and plus Jordan and Morocco. So you have 8 monarchies. And then you have a number of so-called republics that went, because of the influence of this nucleus of patrimonial states, where the rulers, as I said, regard the state as their property, the elite, the armed forces are the private guard, are seen as the private guard. They are connected to the ruling family through familial control, putting members of your family at the head of the key institutions, sectarian, tribal, regionalist, every kind of links are used, organic links, to ensure the control by the ruling family of the state institutions. So you had this, and you had, as I said, as I was starting to say, a process of what I called patrimonialization. And this is something very peculiar, that a few states in the region evolved in a way that would meet the kind of condition that you had in patrimonial states. That's the case of Syria, of Assad. That's the case of Libya, of Gaddafi. And that was the case of Iraq, of Saddam Hussein, where in the 3 cases, we see the rulers starting reshaping the state institution, changing everything, putting their family members and their tribal cronies and the members of their sect in key positions, in order to ensure their full control of the thing, and therefore turn exactly in the equivalent of monarchies, except that they are called republics. And so when Hafiz al-Assad died, his son succeeded him very naturally. They did some, how to say, simulacre of election, a parliament, only the parliament. I mean, that was no one was fooled. The same would have happened for sure. Gaddafi was preparing his son, one of his sons, and the same, Saddam Hussein was preparing his son. And actually, you can see also here an interesting difference is when Mubarak in Egypt started having the project of being succeeded by his son. And here you see the difference between a patrimonial state and a neo-patrimonial state like Egypt. There, the institution is not the property of Mubarak. Mubarak is not the father of the institution. He's the son of the institution. The army produced Mubarak. Mubarak did not produce the army or reshape the army. So they said no. They refused. They rejected, especially that his son is not a military. And that failed. He failed. And so although he had the ambition, but he couldn't realize it because it's a neo-patrimonial state where there is an institutional autonomy. And actually, Egypt is one of 3 states in the Arab region that are where the armed forces are the center of gravity of political power. And these 3 states are Egypt, Algeria, and Sudan. And you can see how the scenario of removal of the president was equivalent in all 3. In all 3 countries, the army, on the background of a big mass movement, the army removed the president. Exactly the same scenario in the 3 countries. This is not possible in a patrimonial state, because in a patrimonial state, the army, through familial, sectarian, tribal ties, is completely controlled by the ruling group. So unless you have a palace coup, as they say, one of them removing the other, otherwise they keep in control. And when they were faced with mass uprisings, they just launch all their violence against it. And you had immediately civil wars very quickly. It turned into civil wars in those countries. So there we see how crucial the nature of the state is between the patrimonial and the neo-patrimonial in that regard. This said, all the region, I mean, you have the patrimonial states, and the neo-patrimonial have a high degree of neo-patrimonialism, high degree of nepotism, high degree of corruption. From that angle, much higher than whatever you could say about Italy or whatever, you know. That's very much incrusted in the system. And that is the reason of this blockage, the economic blockage that I mentioned. That is, when you combine this with neoliberal recipes, you get the results that we mentioned.
Well, thanks for that really comprehensive overview. I think my next question would have been, I think that how to whether we could differentiate among the different waves. I think you have already partly answered about the main differences between the 2 waves. And in that, maybe you want to elaborate. In that specific point, I would ask you, since you have already spoken a bit about your country of origin, Lebanon, about Iraq, because most of the people were, nobody thought that you could have a national scale uprising, or at least interesting the central and southern part of Iraq, those that are not under the Kurdish autonomous government, ever soon, because of the of the militias, all sort of things that make it a quite unique case. So my question would be, again, if you want to say something more about difference among the 2 waves we had so far, and especially on the case of Iraq, which in a way defies a lot of understandings that we had held up to that point.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there are differences between, quite a number actually of differences between the 2 waves of 2011 and 2019. Well, I would say that the first difference is that the second wave comes after the first. And I'm only joking here, but in the sense that the second wave assimilated the lessons of the first. And that shows you that it is a cumulative process. So people are not starting from zero every time. Every time they start from the level that the previous experiences had reached. And here a key difference is between what you had in Sudan, Algeria, and Egypt. I just mentioned that these are the 3 states where the armed forces are at the center. Now, in Egypt, both in 2011 and 2013, you had massive illusions about the army when the army removed the president, right? The massive illusions that the army and the people are one and all that, this kind of slogan, as you know, Gennaro, very well, you were there. These illusions were absolutely absent in Algeria and Sudan 2019, Because in the meantime, people have seen that Egypt had gone back to not only to the old regime, but to much worse. I mean, there's very good ground to say it was much better under Mubarak than under Sisi today. Yeah, unfortunately, but that's a reality. So people understood that, and they are carrying on, they are continuing in both countries their fight for a fully civilian and democratic government, and of course other demands. So that's one important difference. As a general, because if you take each country, then you may find other differences. Like Sudan has a level of organization that is unmatched by any previous experience or any other experience in the region. We may get back to that later. Second difference is that this time the role of Islamic fundamentalist forces has been absent. Unlike the first wave of 2011, where they all managed to ride the wave, they managed to join. They did not initiate it anywhere. Nowhere did they, Muslim Brotherhood in particular, nowhere did they start the thing. But everywhere they joined and tried to hijack it for their own program, their own ambitions, their own political projects. And they played a key role in the region. In 2011, they appeared as if they were the dominant force in this whole process. After that, of course, they suffered a major defeat because the shift from revolution to counter-revolutionary phase came at their expense primarily. They were those who were defeated by the old regime forces in various countries, most clearly in Egypt with the coup, getting rid of the Muslim Brotherhood and crushing them very brutally. So in the second wave, what happens is that actually, first of all, these Islamic fundamentalist forces had already been discredited by their failure in the first wave. And secondly, more importantly, I would say, in all the four countries of the second wave, they are part of power. They were not in the opposition. In Sudan, Sudan is like Sisi plus Morsi combined. That's why I called him Bashir. I called him Morsisi. I wrote an article at that time, "The Fall of Morsisi." That's a combination of Muslim Brotherhood and military dictatorship. In Algeria, the Islamic fundamentalists, the Muslim Brotherhood, they had participated in the governments of Bouteflika. They were part of the deal, and they have no credit in the popular movement any longer anymore. People are wary of also the past that you had in Algeria, the civil war of the 90s. In Iraq and Lebanon, in the two countries, as you were saying about Iraq, Islamic fundamentalist militias, this time not the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Khomeiniist, Iran-linked, Iran-abiding militias are the major part of power. In Lebanon, Hezbollah dominates the government. It's the most powerful armed force actually in the country. And in Iraq, those militias and all that, they dominate the political scene. And yet, you had indeed in Iraq a massive movement against them, expressing the popular anger. And the most interesting thing is that it started among the Shia. It took some time before some Sunnis would join in the capital. But it started among Shia. It was and it was against those militias and against Iran. You had even some Iranian consulate, for instance, in the south was burned by the demonstrators. So that means they don't buy sectarianism. They resent Iranian domination as a foreign and oppressive domination also, because it nurtures fundamentalism and all sorts of cultural oppression, if you want. And of course, they see the levels of nepotism, corruption, and all that, which is huge. At the same time, this is a country with endowed with rich oil resources and all that, but the population lives in misery, and they see at the same time all the corruption that's happening. So yeah, you had this movement, and finally, last but not least, the role of women increased quite significantly in the second wave. We had a role of women. They played the feminist organization in Tunisia in 2011 was at the center of the process. It played an important role. You had some role of prominent role of women even in Yemen, even though it's a country with a terrible oppressive condition of women. But overall, and especially with the role of Islamic fundamentalist forces, the role of women was not prominent as it will be in the second wave. In Sudan, you had more women in the streets than men, and they were very important uprising. In the participation of women is very clear in Algeria, very important. In Lebanon, women were at the forefront of the whole uprising. And even in Iraq, where also you have a very machistic, patriarchal culture, even there, inspired by Lebanon, I should say, you had more and more women and young women, students, actually, when the students joined the movement, entering the struggle. So these are the differences between the two waves. And that's why, again, I end by this, long-term revolutionary processes are cumulative. People learn from the lessons. And therefore, that's one source of hope about the future, that the generations that are getting politicized through these events are learning the lessons of all that. And one can hope that they will manage to organize in an efficient way to be able to produce the change that is required and indispensable if this region is to overcome its present crisis.
Thanks, Gilbert. You also managed to answer one of the questions I want to keep the words. We have like time for, I will give you one more input, then at the same time of many, but actually I want to choose one, and hopefully I already wrote in the chat, if you want to we intervene, please, all of you, either you can raise your virtual hand or write into the chat, and I will collect it as I ask Gilbert for, there are many things. You touched already upon political Islam, so I leave it, and there are a few things I will leave it for later. There is one point, up to the 2010, in spite of all the setbacks, the major issue, let's say at least for international public opinion, was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, the flags of Palestine were almost in all the squares in the first, and even in the second wave, let's say more in Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, but Yemen, but not also. So what happened? I mean, of course, the dynamics are different. In a way, why we didn't have, or did we have a Palestinian Spring? Or what happened? Which impact the Arab uprising had on the conflict, and especially on the development of a new generation of activists, of Palestinian activists? I mean, you have devoted your part of your earlier publication. I remember I have with Lorian Ankam-Dessan, I think, Estin Caldron, and also Arab and Holocaust. So of course it's a matter of, for everybody who works on the region or is from the region. So I think that's, and it's been a bit obscured because of the Arab uprising in terms also of media attention, but even scholarly work, if I can say, and what had been the main, if you want, topic for the last 40 years, I would say.
Right. Yes, that's indeed important observation. I would say the Palestine issue has, in a sense, paid the price of having been central for so long, as you said.
Yeah.
And it has been central and been used by governments very demagogically to justify what they were doing. You know, governments like those of Iraq, Syria, Libya, and all that would justify their, you know, Syria has had a state of emergency in 1966 and never removed it. You had the same issues in other countries, pretexting that they are facing Israel, and that's the key thing. So when the populations enter into motion in 2011, they enter into motion about their own problems. It wasn't about something else. It doesn't mean that they changed their views of Palestine. And you can see that it remains an issue that is dear to the feelings and sentiments in the region of the overwhelming majority. Like, for instance, there is a lot of resentment for the so-called normalization between Arab states and Israel, as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain did recently, the so-called Abraham Accords. So the public opinion, and the polls show the public opinion is against this. They resent this. They don't see. They are not willing to accept the Israeli state as you know, a good neighbor. Now, that's one part of it, but the point is also that the Palestinian scene had evolved dramatically in a way that led to actually even the Palestine solidarity movement globally to get weakened. You know, the spectacle of the division among the Palestinians, the Hamas Gaza control versus Mahmoud Abbas West Bank control and all that, there was nothing more any more inspiring in all that, and that affected the movement and also in the region. Now, if you think of it, the Palestinian scene was a forerunner of the whole sequence of events. That is, the sequence of events of the first wave in 2011 was, you had the explosion, and then you have two forces that come to the fore, and the rest are marginalized. And the two forces are the old regime and the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic fundamentalist opposition. And then it turns into a clash between them. And the left and all other forces are marginalized. That's what happened in the first wave of the Arab uprisings. Now, the Palestinians have had the same. They had their intifada in 1988, a big uprising. This uprising was subdued and all that. The situation got later on under the control of the PLO and Hamas, fighting each other, the two poles, exactly the same political evolution, if you want. And so the clash between these two forces dominated the scene, as happened in 2013 and later in the Arab region as a whole, and you got to the present blockage now. The Palestinian left has been completely discredited. It's completely marginalized. So now it's almost you know, a non-entity. So the two key forces, as those we mentioned, the PLO or Fatah and Hamas, and what is to be expected is that sooner or later you'll have also among the Palestinians, and I mean here, when I say Palestinians, I mean those of the West Bank and Gaza, because you have Palestinians in Jordan, you have Palestinians in Syria. They were part of the uprisings in these countries, yeah? So in the West Bank and Gaza, sooner or later there will be movements from below, you know, of the young generation. They had some, you had some some steps in that direction, like the organization of the March of Return in Gaza, that came from some initiative of young people who organized this. So there are some indications that we might see this, but basically the problem is more political. The feelings in the region remain the same. People remain in full solidarity with the Palestinian people against Israel, but this is no longer if you want, the central problem in the region. All the more that the tragedy of the Palestinians, unfortunately, has been dwarfed now by the tragedies of Syria and Yemen in particular. These two countries in particular have a terrible humanitarian crisis, much more tragic than anything that happened in Palestine in terms of number of people killed, maimed, displaced, and all that. It is something absolutely huge.
Thanks for now, Gilbert. I'm again asking both students and non-students. At the moment, I would say there are half and half of those present. At least I know, we have a small group is a master class. So, but also please, if you have, I bet you do. So don't be shy. I have, of course, plenty of things to say, but we agreed to leave some time not to abuse my being like the lecturer, the professor of the class. I'm ready to do it, but I'm trying to restrain myself as a neo-patrimonial elite. So please, again, if you don't need to be encouraged. So it's now, now it's possible from now on. If you have comments, we have. Okay, let's take one by one. A student of mine, of the course, Cristiano. Yes, please. You can speak.
Thank you. Good morning. I wanted to ask you, Professor Achcar, what do you think about? I didn't quite understand. What's your opinion about what do you think about the most successful democratic movement during the uprisings? What do you think about it? In all Arab countries, I mean.
You mean Tunisia, Cristiano?
In which country do you think there were the most successful movement?
Okay, sorry.
For today, in retrospective.
Okay.
Shall we take one by one or more than one? Let's take one. Go on. Because
Okay. No problem. Yes, the most successful. Well, if we take the first wave, the only country which managed to maintain the democratic gains achieved in 2011 is Tunisia. So there you can say that the democratic transition, that part, was successful in the sense that today Tunisia is, there's good reason to say it's today in relative terms, that's very relative, but in relative terms, it's the most democratic country in the region, where you have real elections, fair, relatively elections, everybody can run in the elections. So it's, from the point of view of procedural democracy, it's there. And this is a big shift, big difference with the Ben Ali era. Now, you had a lot of articles in the media, in reports, IMF, everybody calling Tunisia a success story. And with some Orientalist explanations about the culture there, which, their culture is democratic. That's the fact is, there are two things here. First, if the democratic gains have been maintained in Tunisia, it is for a combination of two reasons. One, which is not the principal, the main one, which is the relative, let's say, relatively modest size of the state apparatus, and especially the armed forces. But more importantly, the factor that made Tunisia the first country to manage to overthrow a dictator, which is the existence of this labor movement as a powerful, organized, autonomous labor movement. And the labor movement has been crucial in maintaining these conditions of democracy in Tunisia. Even the Nobel Prize Committee recognized that by giving them the Nobel Prize a few years ago for this successful transition for the now. Now, at the same time, Tunisia is the very clear illustration of what I said in the beginning, that it is not only a problem of democratic transition, it is a problem of nature, social, political nature of the whole state system that needs to be changed and therefore to change completely the economic orientation and get out from this blockage that has been accumulated over many years. And you can see it. Tunisia, since the democratic transition of 2011, has had several regional revolts and uprisings. Up to this year, started the year 21, started with one full month of big protest of the youth in the impoverished parts of the country, in the neighborhoods, in the regions, all the impoverished parts of the country. We had big movements of the youth, which took some of the forms which reminded people of what happened in 2011. So that shows you that the key problem has not been solved. They had achieved one part, if you want, of the solution, that is freedom and some ability of democratic procedures, but the core problems have not yet been addressed. The governments are still composed of the same social political people group layers that have been dominating the country and its economy for very long. The economic policy is the same neoliberal IMF sponsored policies are applied, and the rest. So that's the point. Now, the other countries, if you look at them, I mean, those where you had overthrow of the ruler, which are 4 countries, Libya, Yemen, therefore, and Tunisia and Egypt. We mentioned Tunisia and Egypt. But Libya and Yemen, what you had, of course, at the beginning, you had real gains. In the year 2012, in both countries, you had real democratic spring, elections and the rest, and political freedoms. But later on, this degenerated when the old regime, on the one hand, and other forces, with Islamic fundamentalist forces on the other, clashed. And that turned into civil war in both countries. In the second wave, I would say, for now, the only success, but it's a mitigated success, is Sudan. But that is because Sudan is the next country with a real organization of the mass movement after Tunisia, and even better, higher standard, more radical than Tunisia. Because in Tunisia, the unions are okay in defending democracy, but they have not, I think, raised to the occasion. From 2011, they should have done it. The union should have been running for election and for power and for a radical change in economic policy. They did not do that. They remained into the fiction, I would say, of that they are only a trade union and they don't get into politics, which is a fiction, because even the whole history is completely against that. They have always been a political factor. Well, that's a matter of the kind of bureaucracy that dominates, but that's a different story. Now, Sudan has a more grassroots built movement than any other countries, and well organized, with 2 components. One is the Sudanese Professional Association, which is a kind of trade union confederation, today, especially, it involves all sorts of unions, professional and workers and everything. And that was built in the underground, so that was not a bureaucratic institution, unlike Tunisia, if you want. And you have the resistance committees, which are absolutely remarkable grassroots youth organization of tens of thousands of young people across the country, organized in committees and using Facebook and those the technology to coordinate their action. They don't have a central leadership or whatever. They refuse that. So they keep coordination in a horizontal way, if you want, not vertical. But they recognize the Sudanese Professional Association as the legitimate spokesperson for the popular movement. So that popular movement in Sudan rose, and the military tried to crush it at some point in June 2019. The mass movement responded with a general strike, and they paralyzed the country, and the military had to negotiate and compromise. They were not able to crush the movement. And so you had a compromise achieved in July 2019, providing for a kind of blueprint for a transition until they have new elections in 3 years. And meanwhile, the formation of bodies of government and the rest that would be in agreement between the military and the popular movement. So you have a compromise, which you can understand because the military couldn't crush the movement, but the movement also could not get rid of the military. It would have been very bloody if they tried. So it is in this kind of transition period with a duality in some way, a duality of power. Of course, the dominance in this duality of power is for the military, but they achieved. I mean, Sudan today, of course, is democratic. I mean, you have real democratic freedoms and all that. How long this will remain is a question mark. The question mark is also valid for every country, including Tunisia. Yeah, so that's the point. The bottom line is the key condition for all that is the organization of the mass movement and its ability to find ways through organization and political, how to say, political smartness, or to be able to lead the movement toward the radical change that is needed. Final point. How do you overcome something like military and whatever, those states? Everywhere you have this problem. The key issue here is the mass movement needs to be able to win over the rank and file of the armed forces. That is the crucial condition for the radical change. Short of that, those armed forces will be used by the governments, or they will themselves, when they are themselves in power, use their power, their force to crush the movements. So the key point is to build up this counter-hegemony in Gramscian terms, if you want, and that this Gramscian hegemony and this war of position should reach even the armed forces themselves, within the armed forces, and that would be the crucial condition for the future.
Thanks for this really answer. We have another student, Alberto, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think my question is following the railroad opened by Cristiano, and the last part of the answer I think is linked with my question. So I hope we can go focusing this part. So the question is, by analyzing the different experience of the so-called Arab Spring, can we draw a line of success, at least in this first phase of process of transformation? And if it's possible, what are the internal and external elements that make an Arab Spring effective and successful? And can any common one be recognized among the different various nations involved in the upsprings movements anyway? So there is a list of elements that have to be present to give birth to a revolution or a uprising. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Right. Yes, we touched upon that in the previous with the previous question, if you want, or my answer at least. Yes, the success. I mean, there are two degrees of success. The full success, that is the implementation of the conditions to overcome the whole crisis and the radical change that I mentioned. For these, the conditions are those that I already described. That is the organization of the mass movement, the popular movement, and its ability to paralyze the repressive power of the state by winning over the rank and file of the state, and especially the armed forces. So this is a high ceiling. Of course, this is very crucial, and this will lead I think, quite a time of maturation and accumulation of experience. In the meantime, the let's say provisional success is to ensure democratic conditions. That's the best scenario. If you may have, like in Tunisia, democratic conditions, and for this, that's why at some point I wrote that the best scenario for me was that even Barack Obama was advocating this compromise between the Muslim Brotherhood and the old regime. I mean, if in Egypt you had a compromise between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military, keeping an open space, of a democratic space like in Tunisia, that would have been much better than one crushing the other, whichever, because when you have one single force dominating, that is a big that makes it much more difficult. So for the popular movement to build itself, if you can have a balance of forces among those forces that are, in my view, part of the counter-revolution. But if you can have among them a balance of forces, if they can neutralize each other, and in a way that opens the democratic space, that is the provisional best scenario for the popular movement to be able to build itself and prepare the future. Now, the internal factors, that's what we said, the ability of the movement to organize and to politically to be, let's say, not to fall in the trap of allying with one of the counter-revolutionary forces against the other, as happened in many countries. Egypt most clearly, where the left and the liberals, those who can be regarded as representing the aspirations of the movement, of the youth, they allied with they shifted from alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood to alliance with the army over 3 years, and instead of defending a third way of the popular movement. So this is also part of the internal conditions. Externally, the problem is that the region faces a lot of counter-revolutions. It's in the same way. It's the most complicated part of the world. Internally, you have at least two big counter-revolutionary poles, the regimes and the Islamic fundamentalist forces. And then externally, you have plenty of counter-revolutionary forces from the United States, European states, Russia, Iran. The Saudi kingdom plays also a regional role. So you have a lot of enemies. Now, as I said, the United States under the Obama administration tried to not to be confrontational with the uprisings and tried to advocate reforms and democratization. That was, I mean, within the limitation, that was of course better than the Trump kind of line, which allied with the Saudi Kingdom and the United Arab Emirates in supporting the dictators over the region. The problem is that Europe is even worse here. I mean, we saw how Europe shifted in the positions from what happened in Tunisia, Libya, and all that. And you can see in Italy, you have a very clear illustration. Italy now is again getting into big arms sale deal with Egypt. You know, so forget the assassination. Forget everything. I mean, business as usual. Business is before everything. When Sisi did his coup and killed over 1,000 people in a massacre in Cairo, the next year François Hollande went there to shake hands. Where at the time when even the United States was, you know, kind of boycotting Sisi, went there to sell him Rafale, you know, as if Egypt, a country with over 1/3 of the population below the poverty line, needed these. You know, I use the comparison that it's like, you know, selling a Lamborghini to a peasant in an oasis who doesn't have camels or whatever. You know, that's the kind of things that happen. So yes, unfortunately those revolutions, they don't have any supporter as a power. I mean, any state on earth that can be regarded as a friend, a real friend of the popular movement. Their only friend would be the popular movement in other states. And that's where in Europe and all that, there is a failure, I think. In the past, there was more or stronger solidarity movements than what we see today.
Well, that was the point that I have left for the end. But before touching it, I see that one student had raised the hand. I don't know why. What happened? Francesco, are you still up for the question, or what happened? Because I saw that you had raised your hand, and then but I don't see it anymore now. And then we have Claudio. Well, while Francesco, I think there is an issue. Okay, Claudio, you can go. Claudio is an Albanian student in our masters. Go, Claudio.
Well, actually, mine is not really a question. I mean, just wanted to say that Professor did a very good thing for saying the fact that the revolutions, they were mostly related to economic issues, and the comparison which was done to Eastern Europe as well. I really love this fact because actually that's how it is. But this fact is really undermined by many researchers. And maybe this is one of the reasons why Eastern Europe and Balkans are very close, you know, to the Middle East and also to the revolutions which are done, and they are mostly done because of the socioeconomic issues and not really for the human rights, as most of the time in the West it's represented.
Okay, and that thanks. Actually, the student had issue with the microphone, so the other one, I'm not sure I'm reading, although I'm not sure I grasp completely, because he's asking Gilbert, could you suggest to us if there are good international organization, okay, I understand, like NGO, that act like modern supervisor, that in a way they do sort of control on the action of European and Arab countries towards military forces, paramilitary and informal arms. In terms of Muraja, more than actually, he wrote like supervision, but in terms is like...
NGOs, I mean, the most important NGO that monitors arms sales and all that globally, not only for the Middle East, is the SIPRI in Stockholm. The Stockholm Institute for Peace Research well, SIPRI, S-I-P-R-I, I forgot the exact meaning of the acronym. So that's the main organization that produces information and monitors very closely these issues from a critical pro-peace, from a peace pacifist perspective. And the fact is that this part of the world, that's also part of the problem, by the way, is if you look at the expenditure for military and security, it's a huge. Even a country like, I mean, if you take even a country like Jordan, 1/3 of their budget is for military and security apparatuses. It's a huge. The Saudi kingdom is the third highest, the country with the third highest military expenditure in the world, you know, after the United States and China. I mean, this is ridiculous when you think of the size of it and all that, but they spend a huge lot of money. If all the states of the region, they have a very high spending, which is of course unproductive, because all this money in buying weapons, in paying salaries to soldiers and police and all that, they are not, excuse me, they are not productive investments which is what such countries would need. And so that's also, of course, a key part of the problem related to the nature, the social, political, and the dictatorial nature of the states in the region.
Guys, we have enough time for inputs. As I wrote on the chat, I mean, there is no discrimination among student and non-students. So I see at least a few friends and colleagues here, but also students. We only heard, yeah, well, there are the over vocal. Well, one sec. Okay, yes, Cristiano has another question, but I really do invite others that might be interested and they've been following up to now. We have, go Cristiano. Yeah?
Yeah, sorry for bothering again, but
no,
since you mentioned Libya before, I was wondering what is left of the democratic movement today, because you mentioned about the civil war, and then I don't know what is the situation today about the democratic movement, because we hear about Syria, about Libya, sorry, really often, and I think two days ago the President Draghi went there, and so I was wondering that. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Of course, it's normal in Italy that you hear a lot about Libya for obvious historical reasons, and also for much more recent reasons. The kind of links that were woven between Gaddafi and Berlusconi at some point, when after Gaddafi had his shift, West-oriented shift in 2003 in particular. Now, what happened in Libya, very, if you want, in a nutshell, if you had an uprising that very quickly, because people knew, they had no illusions that they could topple Gaddafi peacefully, if you want, that he wouldn't leave the scene. So it very quickly turned into civil war, especially that part of the regular army, not the elite forces, which are completely controlled, as in all patrimonial states, by the family, the ruling family. But the regular army, part of it split and joined the insurgents. And so you had this civil war that started, and Europe in particular got very worried about that. First, for the proximity of Libya to European shores, for the fact that Libya was a transit point for migrants and migration, illegal migration, Lampedusa and all that. You know about this a lot, I'm sure. And also because, of course, the most probably important is the oil and gas wealth of the country. So there was these worries among Europeans, and Libya is a big prize because of oil and gas. So when the mass movement in Benghazi, which was threatened by Gaddafi, when they asked for support, no-fly zone to prevent Gaddafi from using his planes against them, the Europeans pushed for that. Obama was very reluctant, but under European pressure, he joined. Now they joined, but they tried by joining, by bombing. Of course, the movement inside Libya had said, we don't want any troops on the ground. And the UN resolution said the same, because that was exactly what the Libyans asked for. And that was why Russia and Moscow abstained, because had it been deployment of troops on the ground, that would have been a different story. Anyway, so the NATO intervention tried to control the movement, but from afar, not being able to deploy troops on the ground. And during that time, they were negotiating with Gaddafi, with his son, Saiful Islam, who was regarded as a good person by Western governments, frequentable guy, they believed. So they were negotiating with him a possible transition to convince his father to step down and hand him power, and then NATO would have said, okay, that's the end. We can have now a compromise. It didn't work. Gaddafi was completely stubborn, which is absolutely not surprising when you look at his history and his character. And the mass movement went far beyond what NATO wanted. They managed, through the insurrection in Tripoli, in the capital itself, they led to dismantle completely the state. So this is the only country in the whole Arab region where the state completely collapsed. There were no more states. And so you had this kind of chaotic situation with a lot of regional militias. Each region has its own militias on a regional, tribal, and all that kind of basis. Now, at the same time, at the beginning, this created a big opening, democratic opening. And as I said, 2012 was a year of a lot of optimism in Libya, about the prospects. You had the elections, and even the surprise in the election was that the Muslim Brotherhood got a very poor score. They weren't expecting that. So there appeared as if there was, a real aspiration to modernization and democracy in the country. Now, what happened is that because of this militia situation, you had the crystallization of two poles. One, which is the Islamic fundamentalist forces, which were and are still in control of Tripoli. And the other is formed of part of the old regime, people of the old regime, including tribes and all that of the old regime, plus the part of the opposition, like especially Haftar, Khalifa Haftar. And you had a government that was negotiated by the UN as the legitimate government, a compromise government in Tripoli, but Haftar, supported by Egypt, by Sisi, that is by the United Arab Emirates, by Russia, and by France recently, had the ambition of seizing power and launch, and that's how you got the civil war in 2014 in Tunisia. One part being Haftar, the other being backed by Turkey and by Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood and their allies being backed by Turkey and by Qatar. So the same scenario that you have regionally, clash between old regime forces plus some other newcomers and Islamic fundamentalist forces. Now you have again the offensive, although failed because of Turkish intervention, which compensated for Egyptian, Russian intervention and Egyptian and Emirati support to Haftar. So the Haftar offensive failed, and again you have a compromise with the UN getting in. As I said, the best scenario is that you have a compromise, a real one, and that this opens a democratic space. And you can see it even now with some women, for instance. There were articles recently about the role of women in pushing for changes, democratic changes in Libya today. That's a good thing. So that's where we are. We are in the same game that you have in the region, which is the worst scenario when you have the clash between the old regimes and the Islamic fundamentalists, and this dominate the scene. So the hope now is for Libya that this new compromise that the UN is trying to sponsor may work. Europe is, of course, in favor of stabilizing the situation because of the problems that it creates. But I think this is the best possible scenario that may allow for a mass movement to build up in that country for the real and the deep problems that we mentioned from the start of this session.
Thanks very much for your clarity and being open to cover practically all. Thanks also, Cristiano, for not being shy. We have 15 more minutes, and of course, I wrote, but actually, I'd rather have other questions or observation for the public rather than from the virtual floor. So if you have, but I don't see any hand raised, nobody. Well, I'll take. Wait, no, not yet. Let's say the latest article I read, it's by you. It's the how to avoid the anti-imperialism of the fool. Actually, and that I think it's been a big issue. To me, I mean, I believe that this idea that the thing is, I believe that one of the, you just touched about the question of international solidarity. And we have noticed that, in fact, at the beginning, yes, of course, but then the pseudo conspiracy theories, they start to spread. I believe, especially the military intervention in Libya and in Syria, they've played the major role, even if at the end of the day, there is also an obscuration of other factors. So I've seen Resident, I've seen Davide, I'll come to you in a moment. So how can we build an honest, rebuild a possible internationalist movement, and to what extent that was possible? That I remember not only, let's say non-Arab or non-Middle Eastern North African have started to believe in that sort of conspiracy, and therefore to have this sort of nostalgia for Gaddafi, Assad, or like pro-Assad. But actually, even within the region now, sometimes the people who did participate in the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, they have moved towards the pro-Assad camp, or they say, well, it was better with Gaddafi, etc., etc., etc. I mean, there is something which is not only about the old anti-imperialist left, so-called anti-imperialist left, but it's something a bit, I'm wondering, is a question of communication, is a question of an invasion of too many factors and the difficulty of make sense of, and also that also has brought the to me the quite grotesque phenomenon of selective solidarity, and it is the typical northwestern Syria versus northeastern Syria. In Italy, we had like days of solidarity with northeastern Syria, meaning the Kurdish, but not for the democratic experience happening on the other side, few kilometers away. And then we come to Davide. I've seen your hand. Go, please, Gilbert.
Yes, thank you, Gennaro. First, just a little note. The title of this article is not mine. I was very angry because
never, of course, they made the titles by themselves. So,
yes, yeah, my title was Their Imperialism and Ours. And I did not want to put any offensive term like fools, that's, and they just changed the title, put this term that I didn't use in the article without consulting me. This is really, irritating. And when I protested, they told me it's not your prerogative. We decide the titles. You don't have to say anything. So, I mean, okay, you can decide the title if it is taken from the article, but you can't bring something that I don't say in the article and put it. Anyway, that's a little side issue. Yeah, no, well, the key point in all those solidarities is that many of them are extremely, and that's true, Orientalist in their perspective about the region, in denying any agency for the people of the region. So they explain everything in conspiracy theory, so there are no popular movements, no people having feelings and all that. So if they tell you Gaddafi was great, so go ask the Libyans. How many Libyans today, I mean, there is certainly some minority in Libya who had privileges under Gaddafi, who regret the time of Gaddafi. But very obviously, the overwhelming majority of the Libyan people, for them, it is a worse nightmare than anything they had since then, the time of Gaddafi. With all you had in Syria, how many Syrians are saying, oh, Assad is fantastic, is better or whatever? I mean, even in the region which are still under his control, you have had recently mass protests against the social economic deterioration and all that. And actually, Assad is a fiction now because the country is completely under Russian and Iranian control. The real struggle now in Syria is between Russia and Iran, not between whatever you have not between Turkey, or Turkey also intervenes, but the real struggle, because in the most of the country is between these two. So the key point is, that's why I wrote this article. To be against imperialism is not in itself the determinant of cannot be in itself the determinant of a policy, especially when you have more than one imperialism. You have American imperialism, you have Russian imperialism, and they are on opposite sides in various ways. So what does it mean to be anti-imperialist? If it means being against both, that's okay, that's very good. However, what does it mean in terms of mass movement? The key point is the starting for any, let's say, democratic understanding is the people's right to self-determination. And you have to recognize the rights of people first. And these people, if they are revolting against a regime, I mean, some people on the left only support mass movements when they are against Western-backed governments. And if they are against Russian or Chinese-backed governments, like in Myanmar today, okay, what do they say? They shut up. What is this internationalism? What is this solidarity? Is the people of Myanmar less worthy of support in their struggles against the military than those of Egypt or those of anywhere else? I mean, that's the point. So really, the crucial point is this recognition of the agency of the popular movement and building policies on the support for the people. And that is, I'm against imperialism when imperialism is oppressing the people, is intervening against the people. I'm not against anything imperialism does in the absolute without taking into account the conditions. So when the United States supported the Kurds, you just mentioned the Northeast, the United States was absolutely instrumental in supporting the Kurdish movement in Syria. Now, those on the left who support Assad have a problem because at the same time they support the Kurdish movement. So why don't you do demonstrations against the United States in doing that? They don't. So they are in full contradiction. If you want to be coherent in position on that, the only line of coherence is the right of the people. Support the rights of the people to self-determination, the democratic rights of the people, the social rights and all that. That's really, I'm speaking here as a person who is very much on the left. For me, that's my starting point. Not the kind of so-called left that ends up, supporting a government that is a thuggish, capitalist, and imperialist government like that of Vladimir Putin. Why is Vladimir Putin better than Joe Biden? I don't see any reason. I mean, in many ways, he's worse. So the problem is, I refuse to choose between these people. I'm against all imperialist powers. My key point is my support to the democratic rights of the peoples concerned. That's a key point.
I'm happy to say that also because I have bombarded my poor students with the idea that even when you talk of colonial rule, we cannot negate the agency of people. Even when uprising failed, it's not just been a Western machination. The people do resist, sometimes do also support. Like there were a lot of Arabs, they had things in common with the colonial powers, and therefore it's not a question of line. We have just a few minutes, if Gilbert can stay with us, with Davide Grasso, please, for a final question, observation, whatever you have, since you've been with us from the very beginning. Grazie. Go on.
Thank you very much to you, Professor Gervasio, and to Professor Achcar. I wanted to actually to go back to what has just been said about the Kurdish movement in Syria especially, and what Professor Achcar thinks about the ideology and the social reforms that this movement has done, and if he thinks that there have been any perception of this change, not only among the rest of the Syrian population, but also abroad in Lebanon or in other Arab countries, about the, let's say, perspective that has been established by the PYD in Syria, if it can be considered a left-wing perspective for Middle Eastern change.
Thank you. Yeah, well, first, the PYD, of course, everybody knows, it's no secret. They are linked to the PKK, which is the Kurdish movement in Turkey. Turkey is the country with the largest number of Kurdish people. The Kurdish nation, as you know, is divided. It's a nation that has been carved up between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria mainly. There are little bits elsewhere, but these are the main countries. And I think historically, the emancipation and unification of the Kurdish nation is a major target for Kurdish nationalism, and I think this is their absolute democratic right, and I fully support the Kurdish people rights, and I've done this from the beginning of my entry into politics. I paid some price at some point, being attacked by Ba'athist and the kind of Arab nationalists and all that racist, anti-Kurdish kind of groups. Now the PYD is, compared to everything you have in Syria, it's no doubt the most progressive armed force among all the armed forces. The rest of armed forces now are completely dominated by Islamic fundamentalists of all shades of Islamic fundamentalism, or Turkish puppets, Turkish-controlled group, the so-called Syrian National Army, which is controlled by Turkey, and Turkey is the principal oppressor of the Kurdish people. So now, at the same time, one should not fall in the myth of having the Paris Commune or anarchism or whatever being in Rojava in northeast Syria. No, the reality is it's a military organization. It's an armed force that is controlling a region. Now they are certainly have good points in, especially in promoting the role of women. That's very important. Of course, it's a very important criterion. So the point is, against Turkey, against ISIS, of course, against Assad, against everyone, I'm in favor of supporting them, because I believe that their cause is right, even if they are not the utopian democracy that some believe naively that you have there, okay? But still, I mean, as I said, they are, and that's why also you had, that was an illustration of what I said, when in 2011, NATO at the beginning intervened to when Benghazi was threatened with being crushed. At that point, at that time, it was in 2011, I said, well, I cannot oppose the intervention in this as long as the city of Benghazi is threatened, because I have no alternative to offer to protect them. But once the planes and all that of Gaddafi had been bombed, yes, I think the NATO should have stopped its intervention. But as I explained earlier, they were trying to control the uprising. Now in Syria, you had the exact same thing, except that people were more confused, because this time it was a clearly left-wing force, the PYD, and the United States rescued them. The United States intervened to help them. I couldn't be against the United States giving them weapons. On the contrary, I'm fully in support of that. I couldn't be against the United States bombing ISIS to protect Kobani, although generally speaking, the bombing campaign of the United States is something that is that produced huge damage, and because it was done in the way a power like the United States behaves, not really looking at people on the ground. So that was very bad. So overall, this bombing is something that I wouldn't condone. I would, in all cases, prefer delivery of weapons to the fighters on the ground and them, and that's also a matter of agency. I'm against the United States or any power taking the place, substituting themselves to the people on the ground. They should empower the people on the ground. And that's what I was saying about the Kurds. So yes. Now, the issue is the Kurdish movement has been ostracized, antagonized by the Arab nationalist regimes. And the problem is the vast majority of the Arab left are Arab nationalists. They claim to be Marxists or whatever. They are, in fact, they are Arab nationalists more than anything else. And they think in terms of, the Kurdish movement in Iraq had connections with Israel, therefore we support Saddam Hussein. I mean, what kind of view of history this is? Where are the rights of the people? Where are the, where is the oppression? Where is the massacre? This is, they evacuate all this. So yes, that's what Gennaro was referring to. In the Arab left, actually, a big part of the Arab left look at as if Iran was a progressive state, and as just because it's against the United States and Israel. No, as I said, as I wrote also, the logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend is a completely rotten, corrupt logic. It leads you to the worst thing, like the Amin al-Husseini because supporting Hitler because Hitler is against the British, and against the Jews, even though Hitler was actually helping the Zionist movement before 1941 to send the Jews to Palestine. Yeah. So, I mean, this logic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is the worst possible logic in politics. And that's the key point. It prevails. And that's why they don't look at the Kurdish movement as any inspiration. They look at it with a lot of, the minimum is, let's say, caution or lack of confidence. And the worst would be regarding them as agents. You know, they transform them into agents, which doesn't make any sense, of course, because they are agents on themselves. They have their own agency. They are not agents of others, as they can be portrayed by the nationalists, the Arab nationalists, the chauvinists, in that regard. So unfortunately, there are no inspiration for the rest of the region. They have much more supporters in the global left than in the Arab left. In the Arab left, they are looked as, you know, something that was with almost, I'm sorry to say, but almost chauvinistic or sometimes racist. And on both sides, if you take Syria, you will see that on the regime side and on the opposition side, you have people anti-Kurdish. You have this anti-Kurdish sentiment, which is, you know, like the kind of anti-minority feelings or ideologies that we know in Europe or elsewhere. You know, so that's here the limitation of that.
Thanks, Davide, for the question. Thanks a lot, Gilbert. I think we are past 2 p.m. I think we've been quiet. You've been very generous to us. And so I really thank you. And I thank also those who have been with us this late morning, early afternoon. And for the students, again, that was the last lecture of the course. So, but what a lecture, I would say, without flattering. So we will be in touch online again before the exams. Again, thanks Gilbert Achcar from SOAS London, and also thanks for all of you for being with us. We will make sure that also we can make it available online in next week. Maybe we will let you know. Thanks again. Have a good afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Gennaro. Thank you, everybody. And arrivederci. I hope in Rome next time.
Yes, possible.